towns and cities with. And Pine Valley supplied that for most of the settlements and communities of southern Utah and Nevada. It was a very valuable resource. Within a short time, there were 7 sawmills operating. The quality of the lumber couldn't be matched anywhere except Mount Trumbull, some 90 miles to the south. The quality was so high that those large ponderosa logs were used to cut the pipes for the Salt Lake Tabernacle organ in 1866.
Edward Lloyd Perry, who was my grandfather, spent 15 years of his life in St. George. He had 7 children born here. 2 of them died when they were very young. He had all kinds of hardship here, but he worked on all the public works. He helped build the tabernacle. He helped build many of the homes. He helped build the St. George Temple. He was what was called the master mason. He was in charge of all of the laying up of the rock and cutting of the rock in those buildings. Immediately, Grandpa went to work on the social hall that was then in progress of being built. He took charge of the mason work of laying the brick or the rock or whatever it was being built of. At this time, when Brigham Young visited, he could see the dire circumstances of the people in St. George, that they didn't have enough to eat, that it was really hard for them. So he decided to start a public works. So he said, I want you to build a meeting house down here that will seat up to 2,000 people. I want it to be very good, very nice. And you can have all of the tithing receipts from Cedar City South. And that's what the men that work on that tabernacle will be paid, is with TO's, tithing office script. They use that sometimes almost as money. If they needed something from somebody who didn't have tithing office script, they'd trade their tithing office script for whatever they needed. We are now in the quarry where they quarried the rock for the tabernacle and later on for the temple, the red sandstone. For my grandfather, this must have been a very arduous task to oversee all of this rock work on both the tabernacle and the temple. They tell me that on the tabernacle, they could tell which man had chiseled each rock because they had a different sized chisel. Also, if we notice the lintels that are over the windows there, they have a very unique design. They're very, sort of a triangular design in them. George Brooks carved the first one of those when Miles T. Romney and my grandfather Edward saw how he had done that. He said, okay, George, you carve all the lintels. So he did all of the lintels over the windows and over the doorways. He was an artist in stone. They had some wonderful carpenters and wonderful plasters. The example of that can easily be seen in the tabernacle today. The plastering that's up around where the ceiling and the walls join. There's designs of the cotton blossoms. There's designs of the grapes, which were a great product in St. George. And my grandfather Perry was a meticulous person. He wanted everything done exactly the way he wanted it done. As I sit here in the quarry, I think of how he demanded respect. He demanded that people do things the way he wanted them done. And as I think of the quarry, and I can sometimes, if I listen really carefully, and I think you could too if you'd listen right now, you could hear the hammers going against the wedges. You could hear the crowbars clanking against the stone. You could hear the oxen grunting and the chains rattling on the wagons as they come around the hill to pick up those rock and haul them back to that temple. I never am around that quarry, but I feel like I can hear those men shouting to each other, Well, some of their language may not have been too good, but I'm sure they were very careful because they knew they were doing the Lord's work.
There are stories that are just legend, have become almost legend, but they're true stories. The tabernacle, they were able to build that whole building without the outlay of cash because of the tithing script and the labor. But they came to the windows and they needed cash. They couldn't trade with anybody for a window. They didn't know how they were going to raise the cash. They worked and worked and worked to raise cash to pay for the windows, and they couldn't raise much money. They had checked it out and they found out that the windows would cost $800. And they had worked for several months and they only had $200 raised in cash. Well, the people were faithful. They suggested that we've got to go. We've ordered the windows from Boston. They've come around the Cape Horn. They're now in LA. We've got to go down and get them. And they prepared to go. In the morning they were to leave. A man from Washington, 5 miles away, walked from Washington to St. George. He said, I brought some money with me from England. I was going to use it to build me a home with, but you need it worse than I do. And he had $600 cash in his pocket. That's an amazing story. But that isn't the end of the story. How would you like to be the one, the Brigham Young or the Erastus Snow said, I want you to drive to LA over the roads they had and the teams they had, pick up 2,200 panes of glass, bring them home, don't break any, and hurry. Well, obviously it worked. They went to LA, they got the windows, they brought them back, they installed them, and much of the glass in the tabernacle is that original glass.
Brigham Young really was the principal designer of the tabernacle and the temple, as he was of the Salt Lake Temple. He came down after the tabernacle had progressed to the point that the balconies were in and the magnificent spiral staircases were in. He objected to the fact that the balcony was too high and they couldn't see the pulpit. So he said, we've got to shorten those spiral staircases. Miles Romney, who had built them, said, you don't touch those. Those staircases will remain. Well, ingeniously, Brigham settled the question by having the balcony lowered 5 feet and steps built from the top of the spiral staircases down to the balcony.
They had 2 springs in the community, one on the east end of town and one on the west end of town, and by a very careful surveying, they brought those together into the community so that they could run down each block, and all the people could be serviced by this water, but it was on a 24-hour basis. And the time of day and night wasn't always at the same time, because the watering would be on odd numbers. So therefore, you may have it at noon on one day, and then next week when it was your turn to get the water, it might be 2 o'clock in the morning. But the biggest difficulty, people didn't have watches. And what a big boon it was to get in that clock on the tabernacle. Wow, that was the day, because then that settled all of arguments, because who knew when it was 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock? Many a time there was quite a bit of friction between the brethren, and had to settle arguments as to who was getting the water, when and how and why, and it was a very difficult time.
Well, if you ever drive up through the gorge and you take that turn and you see that temple, it just, I think it's white because it makes a major statement. It presides over this town just completely. There are other reasons, I think. You know, when you look at the tabernacle, you'll find that the stone is very delicately finished. This stone is not. It's just rough. And they intended right from the beginning to have the plaster, so they didn't go through the elaborate work of having finished stone. But I think they wanted to make a statement. That's why it was placed here. This, you may not notice it, but this is a little higher, so that the temple is up on a little bit of a hill, and it very clearly stands out. Did then, still does. They decided to place a temple in St. George because the project to build the temple in Salt Lake was stymied. Had they been able to go forward and complete the temple in Salt Lake, there wouldn't have been a need for the temple in St. George. Now, why is that? Brigham Young was absolutely bound and determined that a temple had to be built before he died. The apostles who administered the temple ordinances in Nauvoo there was only a handful that were alive, and they were elderly. And so those who had administered those were the only ones who knew the temple ceremony. And they had to make sure that it got placed in a temple before they died. And Brigham Young had a deep concern about that personally. So he needed to have a temple and see that the temple ceremony was correctly instituted there, because it has to be done inside the building. And so, when it became clear that they were in a protracted conflict with the federal government, they saw they weren't going to get the Salt Lake Temple built. Okay, so that solved that one. So they needed a temple. Well, why not Logan? Why not Manti? Why St. George? They had this problem with the federal government, and they needed to get out of the view of the federal government. St. George was very remote. It was isolated. There was no railroad to get here. It never would have a railroad here. It was extremely difficult to get down that Black Ridge from Cedar City. And so they thought that they could get roads and railroads and so forth here, but it never happened. So St. George was isolated. They could work in St. George and not be noticed. That's the second reason. First reason was the conflict with the federal government. Second was that it was isolated. Third was that this colony was very important in Brigham Young's eyes, but it wasn't surviving. The agriculture down here was agriculture in the desert. What they had been doing was agriculture in a semi-arid area, but this is real arid. And so what they didn't know when they came down here is that they couldn't just transport the skills that they had from Bountiful and Parowan and Beaver to here, because when it rains here, the water rushes off the hills, floods, destroys the canals, and their agricultural system gets ruined, and then it won't rain again for 6 or 8 weeks, during which time their crops die. So the colony was not succeeding agriculturally, and yet Brigham Young didn't want to abandon the colony. So he decided in about 1863 to subsidize the colony, and that's what created the St. George Tabernacle. It got 100 people employed for 7 years and helped the colony survive. When the Tabernacle was about to an end, they were facing the problem with the federal government, and they had to decide a different location for the temple, and so they decided to do it here because they could build fast. They had an expert crew of trained workers. The colony desperately needed the economic subsidy. They could do it kind of without being seen by the federal government. All those factors worked together, and it succeeded. They were able to build a temple on fast track. The architect of the St. George Temple was Truman O. Angell. He was also the architect of the Salt Lake Temple. He had been one of the builders of the Nauvoo Temple. And so this temple was almost a copy of the Nauvoo Temple.
Erastus was very heavily involved for those 18 years, and in those times, of course, the temporal and governmental side of things were very commingled with the church. And so while he was the leading church authority here in the area, he also served as the president of many irrigation boards and was president of the local co-op, and there was a great deal of both temporal and ecclesiastical responsibilities that he had. Of course, the effort in building the tabernacle and the temple he was very keenly involved in. There's a great number of wonderful stories about how he really tried to keep those